It is the morning of January 9th, 1942. The Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. The jungle is thick and still damp from the overnight air. Somewhere to the north, the sounds of the wider war artillery, aircraft, the distant rumble of a front that keeps moving south, have become the background noise of daily life for the American and Filipino defenders holding this narrow strip of land between the mountains and Manila Bay. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Morett sits in the commander's position of his M3 Stuart light tank. He is 26 years old. He has 3 weeks of combat experience, and through his vision blocks, advancing through the jungle 400 yards ahead of his position, he can count 8 Japanese Type 97 Chiha medium tanks moving in column formation. His platoon has 3 stewards. Every briefing Morett has sat through, every intelligence report passed down the chain of command, every rumor that has circulated through American positions for the past 3 weeks has carried the same message. Japanese tanks are battle-tested killers. They crushed Chinese armies for 4 years. They steamrolled through Malaya in under 2 months. They destroyed British armor in Singapore. An official doctrine from higher command is explicit and unambiguous: preserve the tanks. Avoid engagement with superior enemy forces. Withdraw when outnumbered. 3 to 1. By every calculation the Army has taught him about armored warfare. This moment calls for one thing. Morett keys his radio. We're going to find out what these guns can do. Those words, transmitted to his platoon and preserved in the 192nd Tank Battalion's after-action report filed later that same day, would mark the moment that an entire myth began to die. The machine that built a legend. To understand why Morett's decision was so extraordinary, you need to understand what the Type 97 Chiha actually was, and more importantly, what it was designed to do. The Chiha entered service with the Imperial Japanese Army in 1937. Its name comes from Old Japanese military nomenclature, and Type 97 refers to the imperial year 2597, which corresponds to 1937 in the standard calendar. The tank was developed by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to replace the aging Type 89, which had proven to slow to keep up with the motorized infantry Japan was increasingly deploying in China. The Army wanted a tank that could travel at around 35 kilometers per hour to stay pace with truck-transported troops. Mitsubishi delivered a design weighing roughly 15 tons, powered by a 170 horsepower air-cooled diesel engine with a crew of 4. The main gun on the standard Chiha was a Type 97 57mm piece. It sounds powerful enough on paper, but there is a critical detail buried in those specifications that would determine everything about what happened on Bataan. That 57mm gun was a low infantry support weapon. It had been carried over from the Type 89 and was designed primarily to blast machine gun nests, demolish field fortifications, and break up infantry defensive positions. Its muzzle velocity was modest. Its armor-penetrating capability was limited. Japanese designers had not built the Chiha to fight other tanks. They had built it to kill soldiers behind cover and against Chinese infantry armed with rifles and small arms. It performed exactly as designed. The armor reflected the same philosophy. Maximum thickness on the Chiha's front hull and turret sat at 25 millimeters. Side armor measured 20 millimeters. The roof and floor dropped to as little as 8 millimeters in some areas. Japanese engineers had calculated correctly for their intended battlefield that 25 millimeters would stop rifle rounds and machine gun fire, and most of what the Chinese Nationalist Army could throw at a moving armored vehicle. They had not engineered the Chiha to survive encounters with high-velocity anti-tank guns, because Japan's war planning had not seriously contemplated that scenario. The assumption was that American forces in the Philippines would be swept aside quickly, before any meaningful armored confrontation could develop. What Mitsubishi built was a very capable tank for the war. It was designed to fight. The problem was that by December 1941, that was no longer the only war Japan found itself fighting. The first warning, nobody listened to the truth, is the Chiha's limitations had already been exposed, just not by the Americans. In the summer of 1939, Japan became involved in a border conflict with the Soviet Union on the steppes of Mongolia, in what is known as the Battles of Kholkhin Gol, or the Nomonhan Incident, as the Japanese called it. This was the Chiha's first real test against opposing armor, and the results were sobering. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks, armed with high-velocity 45mm guns, simply outranged the Japanese 57mm weapon. The Soviet guns could punch through Japanese armor at distances where Japanese rounds fell harmlessly short. The regimental commander's own Type 97 became trapped in a wire obstacle during one engagement, drew fire from a dozen Soviet tanks and anti-tank guns, and was torn apart by the resulting hits. The turret was blown completely off. Japanese losses at Khalkhingal were severe. The Imperial Army walked away from that battle with a clear and urgent lesson. The Type 97's main gun was inadequate for armored warfare against a modern enemy with proper anti-tank weapons. Development of a new 47mm high-velocity gun began immediately in 1939. And by the end of 1941, an improved variant of the Chiha, or new turret version, was entering production. But the 1939 lesson had not reached the ears of American planners in any useful form. And the tank variant available in the Philippines in December 1941 was the original Chiha, with the old 57mm gun and 25mm of frontal armor. The improved version would not see combat until Corregidor in 1942. Tank that American forces believed was nearly invincible was an already outdated design that had been embarrassed by Soviet light tanks 3 years earlier. A reputation forged against opponents who couldn't fight back. So, where did the myth come from? From the same place most military myths come from: a string of victories against opponents who lacked the right equipment to fight back. When Japan invaded China, beginning in 1937, the National Revolutionary Army possessed almost no effective armor of its own. What they had was a small, mixed collection of British Vickers tanks, German Panzer I light tanks, and Italian CV-33 tank jets, all of them thinly armored, underpowered designs that couldn't threaten a Chiha at any practical combat range. Against these opponents, the Type 97 was dominant. Its 57mm gun was more than sufficient to destroy anything the Chinese could put in its path, and its 25mm armor was impenetrable to the small arms and light weapons that formed the bulk of Chinese anti-armor capability. Then came Malaya and Singapore in December 1941 and January 1942. When Japan invaded Malaya, they brought over 200 tanks, a mix of Type 95 Hago light tanks, Type 97 Chihas, and Type 89 medium tanks. The British and Commonwealth defenders, meanwhile, had exactly 23 obsolete MKVB light tanks from the Indian Army's 100th Light Tank Squadron, none of which were remotely capable of armored combat against Japanese armor. The rest of the British armored element consisted of armored cars and Bren carriers, designed for reconnaissance and infantry support. Japanese tanks rolled through the Malayan jungle in areas British commanders had declared impassable for armor, appearing in places where no defensive lines had been prepared, punching through position after position in a campaign that lasted barely 2 months and ended with the fall of Singapore on February 15, 1942. When 130,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops surrendered at Singapore, the news echoed around the world. Japanese armor, and the Chiha, in particular, carried a massive share of the credit. The reputation that arrived in American briefing rooms was just not earned against the kind of opponent the Americans actually had available to fight with. The weapon nobody knew could win here is what makes the situation on Bataan so remarkable. The Americans were not, in fact, outgunned. They just didn't know it yet. The M3 Stuart light tank that the 192nd and 194th Tank Battalions had deployed to the Philippines in the fall of 1941 was a genuinely capable machine. By the era standards for light tanks, the Stuart was heavily armored. Its frontal hull measured 38 to 44 millimeters. Its gun mantlet reached 51 millimeters. The turret sides were 38 millimeters. That armor was more than twice the thickness of the Chiha's maximum 25 millimeters. And it faced a Japanese 57mm gun that fired low-velocity rounds designed for infantry support, rounds that lacked the penetrating energy to threaten an M3 Stuart's frontal armor at any realistic combat range. The Stuart's armament told an even more decisive story. The 37mm M6 gun mounted in the turret was a high-velocity anti-tank weapon. Technical data that nobody on Bataan had access to showed that this gun could penetrate 61mm of armor at 100 yards, 53mm at 500 yards, and 46mm at a full 1,000 yards. The Chiha's thickest armor sat at 25mm. The math is not complicated. An M3 Stuart could put a round through the front of a Chiha at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, more than a mile away. At close range, that 37mm shell would punch through the front armor, cross the fighting compartment, and exit through the rear armor with energy to spare. The problem was simple. Nobody knew. American intelligence estimates of Japanese armor had been badly wrong, overstating Chiha armor thickness by as much as double the actual figure. The technical specifications were classified and unknown, and without a single confirmed engagement where an American tank crew had stood and fought, there was no empirical data to correct the miscalculation. The fear that had paralyzed American armor operations on Bataan was built entirely on incomplete information, a formidable reputation, and one catastrophic first encounter that had established a pattern of retreat before a single shot was fired in anger. The first retreat, and how a pattern is born. That encounter happened on December 22, 1941, near the town of De Mortis on the Lingayen Gulf. A single M3 Stuart from Company B of the 192nd Tank Battalion spotted 3 Japanese Type 97 Chihas advancing down a coastal road. The American crew held a position of advantage, clear fields of fire, the element of surprise, the Japanese column unaware of their presence. Every condition favored the Americans. Every doctrine said engage. But the American tank commander, his name never recorded in official reports, had received the same intelligence briefings as everyone else. Heavily armored, battle-tested, superior to Allied designs. And nobody had ever tested whether a 37mm round could actually penetrate Japanese armor, because nobody had ever tried. Watching the Japanese tanks close to within 300 yards, well within the effective range of his main gun, the American commander chose not to fire. He reversed out of his position and withdrew 2 American lines, filing a report of contact with superior Japanese armor. 3 Japanese tank commanders watched the American withdrawal and reported to their superiors what they had seen. American tanks were unwilling to fight. American armor in the Philippines posed negligible threat. The conclusion was recorded and distributed. Henceforth, Japanese columns would advance without the tactical preparations, the dispersed formation, the careful approach that would have been standard against an enemy expected to engage. From December 22nd through January 9th, the pattern held with almost mathematical consistency. Japanese tanks advanced. American tanks withdrew. Infantry fought without armored support. The retreat continued southward, deeper into Bataan. Thousands of American and Filipino soldiers died or were wounded defending positions that might have held, or fallen differently, if the tanks behind them had ever turned and fought. Morett had watched all of this for 3 weeks. He had seen the infantry pleading for tank support that never came because the tanks were being preserved for a future engagement that never seemed to arrive. Preservation doctrine, he had concluded, was not protecting the Army's most valuable assets. It was getting soldiers killed. 18 minutes the first round from Mitchell's gun crossed 600 yards in just over a second. It struck the lead Chiha's front hull armor. It did not ricochet. It did not deflect. The 37mm armor-piercing shell punched straight through 25mm of Japanese steel, traveled across the interior of the fighting compartment through the crew, and exited through the rear armor, continuing into the jungle beyond the tank before the trajectory finally spent itself. For maybe 2 seconds, nothing dramatic was visible. Then flames began erupting from the commander's hatch as the ammunition inside the Chiha began cooking off from the heat of the penetration. The tank rolled forward another 20 yards on its own momentum before it veered off the trail and stopped, smoke pouring from every opening. Morett's first thought was a single word. He didn't transmit over the radio. Weak. Mitchell reloaded. The second Chiha in the column took a round through the turret mantlet at 550 yards. A third took a hit from Sergeant Robert Quinn Stewart at 500 yards. The remaining 6 Japanese tanks attempted to deploy from column into line, which was standard doctrine when caught in an ambush. But the jungle terrain restricted their maneuver space and all 3 American tanks were already firing. The 4th Japanese tank burned at 450 yards. The 5th, attempting to reverse away from the ambush, was hit at 400 yards. One Japanese commander made a decision that reflected either desperate courage or pure tactical logic. If the Chiha's 57mm gun couldn't penetrate an M3 Stuart at range, perhaps it could at point blank. He drove his tank directly toward Morett's position, accelerating to maximum speed, approximately 24 miles per hour, closing from 400 yards to 300 to 200 to 100. Mitchell tracked the incoming tank calmly. At 100 yards, Morett could see the individual details of the approaching Chiha, the commander's head visible through the open hatch, the rising sun insignia painted on the turret. He gave the fire command. The 37mm round at that range didn't just penetrate the Chiha's front armor. It destroyed everything inside the crew compartment and continued through the rear, armored before burying itself in the jungle 100 yards beyond the tank. The dead driver's foot slipped from the accelerator. The Chiha rolled forward on momentum until it stopped less than 10 yards from Morett's Stuart. Through his vision blocks, Morett could see the penetration hole, a ragged circle roughly 3 inches in diameter, where the round had entered. He could see daylight through it. The shell had treated 25mm of Japanese armor like it was not even there. The 8th and final Chiha was attempting to flee when the flanking Stuart caught it at 600 yards with a shot through the rear. Armor, the weakest point on any tank. Morett checked his watch. 633. 80 minutes had passed since he gave the order to engage. 8 Japanese tanks destroyed. 0 American tanks damaged. 0 American casualties. What the numbers? Mental Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Miller, commanding the 192nd Tank Battalion, arrived at 0715 in a jeep. He had issued the preservation doctrine that Morett had violated. He walked the 200 yards of burning wreckage, counted the destroyed Chihas, and inspected the penetration damage himself. Using a measuring tape from his map case, he verified the armor thickness of the destroyed tanks to 25mm at the thickest points, less than half what American intelligence estimates had indicated. Miller asked Morett to explain what had happened. The report was brief. 8 enemy tanks engaged at ranges from 600 yards down to 10 yards. All 8 destroyed. American 37mm penetrated enemy armor at every range tested. Japanese 57mm gun appeared ineffective against Stuart frontal armor at all distances engaged. When Miller asked why Morett had chosen to engage instead of withdrawing as doctrine required, the answer was equally direct. The tanks were not serving any purpose sitting in reserve, while infantry died without armored support. The only way to get accurate information about Japanese tank capabilities was to fight. Miller nodded and issued new orders on the spot. The 192nd Tank Battalion would aggressively seek out Japanese armor, engage at every opportunity, and exploit the capabilities advantage that had just been demonstrated in 18 minutes of actual combat testing. Preservation doctrine was finished. Word spread through American positions on Bataan within hours, carried by infantry who had watched from their foxholes and by tank crews who heard the radio transmissions. Japanese tanks could be killed. American guns could penetrate them easily. The fear that had shaped 3 weeks of tactical decisions dissolved against the evidence of 8 burning wrecks. The war doesn't wait for the wounded. Tamif may have died on January 9th, but the Japanese were not finished testing it. On February 2, 1942, at 0530, the Japanese 4th Tank Regiment launched a coordinated assault on American defensive lines, with more than 40 Type 97 Chiha tanks supported by infantry and artillery. The objective was to break through entirely, reach Manila Bay, and split the American-Filipino defensive position. Their mass attack doctrine was straightforward. If 5 American tanks could destroy 8 Japanese tanks, then 40 Japanese tanks should overwhelm American positions through sheer numbers. The 192nd Tank Battalion positioned 18 operational M3 Stuarts in pre-prepared defensive positions. Morett's platoon covered a section of trail where intelligence predicted heavy armor activity. The Japanese advance began in darkness, hoping to reach American lines before first light could expose them to defensive fire. They did not know that American crews had spent the night preparing ambush positions, specifically to receive them. The first Japanese tanks appeared as silhouettes against the pre-dawn sky at 0545. Morett held his fire, counting at least 12 Chihas in the lead elements, with more following. He keyed his radio, confirmed all American positions were ready, and opened the ambush at 0550. His Stuart destroyed the lead Chiha with a penetrating hit at 500 yards. Within 30 seconds, 5 more Japanese tanks were burning from hits scored by the other American tanks in the kill zone. At 0623, a Japanese infantry squad worked close enough to Morett's position to engage with rifle grenades. One exploded against his commander's cupola, as he sat with his head partially exposed. Shrapnel tore through the exposed skin of his face and shoulder and embedded itself in his jaw. Blood poured down into his uniform. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear his crew shouting over the intercom, "Are you hit? How bad? Do we evacuate?" His response over the intercom was 4 words. "Keep loading. Keep firing." For the next 3 hours, while Japanese attacks continued up and down the line, Morett directed fire from his Stuart with 11 separate fragment wounds in his face, jaw, shoulder, and upper back. He used his remaining vision and blood-smeared vision blocks to identify targets. He called out fire commands, while his jaw swelled and his uniform stiffened with drying blood. When the Japanese finally withdrew at 0930, his platoon had destroyed Ju Chiha tanks. 4 before he was wounded, 6 more while he bled. The engagement's final numbers told the complete story. 18 M3 Stuarts against more than 40 Taipa Kyujin Nanashihei. 27 Japanese tanks destroyed outright. 12 more so severely damaged they were abandoned by their crews. 0 American tanks destroyed. 0 American tank crew members killed. The Japanese 4th Tank Regiment, which had entered the battle as a coherent fighting force, was effectively destroyed as a unit and never again operated at full strength during the Philippine campaign. A pattern that held to the end of the war. The Japanese understood by late January that their armor was not working against American M3 Stuarts and began adapting their tactics. But adaptation options were limited when the fundamental problem was a technological mismatch that couldn't be repaired in the field. Japanese tank commanders began routing their advances through terrain where they believed American armor couldn't follow. When that wasn't possible, they attempted mass attacks. The theory being that if enough tanks charged simultaneously, some would survive to close with American positions. February 2nd showed exactly how that theory performed against prepared defenders with technically superior equipment. Captured Japanese tank crew members later provided interrogation reports that illuminated the psychological dimension of the disaster. They described watching American rounds punch through their armor while their own weapons bounced off American tanks. They described the moment of understanding that their vehicles offered no real protection against enemy fire. One captured Japanese tank commander stated through an interpreter that facing American armor in a Type 97 felt like fighting without proper equipment. Several prisoners expressed surprise that American forces had ever retreated from tank engagements, given what they now knew about the capability mismatch. The Americans had possessed obvious superiority from the start. They simply hadn't known it. From Bataan forward, the kill ratio that emerged in those first engagements held relatively constant across the entire Pacific War. American armored forces destroyed Japanese tanks at ratios exceeding 10-1, with some engagements approaching 20-1 or higher. The total Pacific War accounting shows American armored forces destroyed over 1,000 Japanese tanks, while losing fewer than 50 American tanks to Japanese tank fire in tank versus tank combat. The 37mm gun that American planners considered inadequate for European warfare, and which British forces in North Africa found increasingly useless against German armor, proved more than sufficient for every Japanese tank that the Pacific War produced, right up to Japan's surrender in 1945. Japanese designers, to their credit, understood the problem. The Shinhato Chiha, with its improved 47mm gun, was a genuine improvement, and Japan attempted to develop more capable designs throughout the war. But the Imperial Japanese Army faced a persistent structural disadvantage. The Imperial Japanese Navy held resource priority. Materials that might have gone into tank production went instead to ships and aircraft. Japan produced 2,208 Chiha variants over the course of the war, a substantial number, but dwarfed by American tank production, and still fundamentally behind the curve in terms of armor and firepower against the advancing generation of Allied designs. By 1944 and 1945, Japanese commanders were burying their Chihas in the ground and using them as stationary gun emplacements rather than mobile offensive weapons, surrendering the very tactical mobility that armor is meant to provide, because there was no better choice available. After the Bataan fell on April 9, 1942, General Edward King surrendered his command. Roughly 75,000 Filipino and American soldiers, in the largest surrender in American military history to that point. Morett had returned to duty on February 23 after 3 weeks of recovery from his wounds, and he fought through the final weeks of the campaign. When the end came, he was captured along with everyone else. What followed was one of the worst chapters of the Pacific War. Approximately 75,000 prisoners were forced to march 65 miles north to internment camps in what became known as the Bataan Death March. The conditions of the march were characterized by severe physical brutality, denial of food and water, and outright killings of those who fell or could not continue. Estimates of those who died during the march itself vary widely, but thousands perished and thousands more died in the camps in subsequent months from disease, starvation, and the accumulated damage of the march itself. Morett survived all of it. He endured 3.5 years of Japanese captivity, the details of which remained largely private. Fellow survivors later described conditions that tested human endurance beyond anything they had experienced in combat. Liberation came in 1945 when American forces returned to the Philippines. Morett weighed less than half his pre-war body weight. He suffered from multiple tropical diseases. He carried psychological damage that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He returned to the United States in late 1945 and received a Silver Star, with a citation that specifically mentioned his decision to engage Japanese armor when outnumbered and his continued fighting after being wounded. He did not remain in military service. He returned to civilian life in Ohio, married, raised a family, and worked in manufacturing. He rarely spoke about the battles, or the captivity, or the years in between. He died on November 3, 1989, at the age of 71. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer noted his service and his time as a prisoner of war, but said nothing about the tank battles on Bataan, where he had helped establish the truth about American armor superiority in the Pacific. The 192nd Tank Battalion, the unit he had served with, was effectively destroyed during the Philippine campaign. Most of its personnel were killed in combat, died in Japanese captivity, or never fully recovered from what the war had done to them. Of the 593 officers and men who deployed to the Philippines in October 1941, 328 did not survive the war. The battalion was never reconstituted. What fear actually cost the core lesson of what happened on Bataan in January and February. 1942 is not really about tanks. It's about what happens when military decisions are made on the basis of reputation rather than evidence, and what the cost of that confusion is in human lives. American tank crews in the Philippines had better armor, better guns, and a geometric advantage in the likely outcome of any engagement against Chiha tanks, and they spent 3 weeks retreating from that advantage because nobody had tested it. Infantry fought and died on defensive positions, without armored support that was available and capable and simply not being used. The preservation doctrine that was supposed to protect American armor for the decisive battle managed only to ensure that American armor never fought the battles that were actually happening. Morett's decision to engage, made in 5 seconds, transmit it in one sentence. Executed by a 22-year-old gunner with perfect.com broke the pattern and proved the point. You cannot know what your weapons can do until you use them. You cannot know what the enemy can withstand until you make them withstand it. Intelligence, estimates, and reputation, and received wisdom are not the same thing as combat data. And the difference between those things has a price measured in lives. That the Type 97 Chiha, that seemed invincible in December 1941, was exposed as a death trap by January 1942. That revelation came not from any change in the tank or the weapon facing it. It came from the moment one sergeant decided that the only way to get accurate information was to fight. The 37mm gun that punched through both sides of a Japanese tank at 10 yards was the same gun that had been there all along, waiting to be used. Context mattered. Equipment designed for one environment failed catastrophically in another. And fear, it turned out, was not a rational response to Japanese armor. It was a habit that had been allowed to become doctrine. Benjamin Morett and the men of the 192nd Tank Battalion deserve to be remembered, not just as soldiers who fought bravely and suffered terribly, but as the men who discovered, in 18 minutes of actual combat, that the enemy they had feared most was never as formidable as the fear itself. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Everyone tells YouTube to show this channel to more people who want to know the real history behind World War II. Subscribe to World War II, explained if you haven't already, and turn on notifications, because we bring you stories like this every single day. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in the Pacific. These tankers prove that fear was the real enemy. It's worth remembering why.